is starting.
Thank you.
I'm going to mention a couple of things before we begin. If you don't know about it, JP was admitted to the hospital. He's having some extreme pain. They don't know what's causing it. And so I don't know if he's out of the hospital yet or not, but he was admitted to the hospital, I think it's last Friday. So keep him in your prayers, if you will. Forrest Bunnell, I talked to him earlier this week, and he's doing much better. He hopes he'll be able to come and be with us in 2 to 3 weeks. And so he's still having a lot of pain in his legs and everything. So please do remember him in your prayers. Ovita, I'm not sure where the Basses are today. They weren't leaving until this Saturday, I thought, but maybe they left yesterday. Anyway, Arthel's sister passed away. Remember them, because they'll be going out to California to take care of that funeral. And Ovita's brother-in-law and sister both are in a lot of health issues. There's probably some others. The other thing I want to mention about this situation for Wednesday night. Jason probably said more than he should have said last Sunday night, because I didn't need any comments made about me being 57 years in the Lord's body. But I will say this, that in all my life, I've never been at a congregation where we changed services because of any holiday. I came back from Korea. In my home congregation, it happened to be Sunday was Christmas Eve, and they announced that they were not going to have services that Sunday night because it was Christmas Eve. And that was the one time I told them, I says, look, if you'll at least unlock the doors, we'll come in and have a song service and scriptures. They had more people in attendance that night than they had on any Sunday night.
Praise the Lord.
This deal, yeah, there's nothing wrong with having Bible class on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Nothing wrong with that. But listen to some of you and my feelings about it. Anytime we change services for a man-made holiday, there's a problem with that. And that's why we made the decision to keep it at Wednesday night. So hopefully you'll be here this Wednesday night. After all, if you're going to celebrate Christmas, you're going to do it Tuesday night anyway, or Wednesday morning. And we'll be here Wednesday night. So we're going to begin with a prayer. And let's bow our heads in prayer. Our most loving Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this beautiful Lord's Day. We're thankful for your love and your patience with each and every one of us. And we're thankful for the many blessings you've blessed us with, especially the spiritual blessings, for your saving grace, for your forgiveness of sins, and most importantly for your Son Jesus, who willingly sacrificed his life on the cross that we might have everlasting life if we'll be faithful to thee. We have members, Father, who are not able to be here because of sickness and poor health. We ask that you would be with our brother J.P. Lusby, be with the family members of this congregation as well, because many of them are suffering as well. We ask also, Father, that you'd be with our elderly members as their health is declining because of age, and we ask that you would be with us and use us as instruments to reach out and help them in any way that we can. We're thankful, Father, for your word. We're thankful, Father, for the opportunity we have to study your word without fear of persecution. And we ask that you would be with us as we continue our study in the book of Hebrews, that we might have an understanding of how it applies to us this day. These things we ask in Jesus Christ's holy name. Amen. Does anybody need a copy? I have a couple of copies here, and I have more copies out in the... Let me stick my head out here and get a few more copies. Anyone else need a copy?
That's lesson 5 you're handing out, right?
Yes, it is. We're going to summarize lesson 4, and then we're going to get into lesson 5. So, if you'll notice the slide I have up here and everything, this is summarizing lesson 4, okay? This was chapters 3, verses 1 through 19. These were the things we studied. Verse 1 told us we are partakers of the heavenly calling, and if we hold fast to the end. And we are partakers of Christ. And we are told not to harden our heart. And we were instructed to take heed lest, in other words, beware, brethren. You depart from the living God with an evil heart of unbelief, hardened through deceitfulness of sins. Those are the things we learned in chapter 3. So, continuing with that, we have Israel as an example, and we have application for Christians. Israel had rest in the promised land of Canaan. We have a promise of rest as well, and that's chapter 4, verse 1. Israel died in the wilderness. They did not receive the promise, and that was all men fighting 20 years of age. They died because of their rebellion. We can be lost also if we look at Acts the 13th chapter, or the 8th chapter. We can be lost if we fail to obey as well. Israel, because of their unbelief, is why they suffered consequences. We too can suffer consequences because of unbelief. If we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 11, we're not going to go to there, but because we looked at it last week, we find the example of Israel being lost because of their unfaithfulness. Now, with that said, with every lesson, we have to have a few questions. No, I got one more slide. I forgot about that one. Okay, this is it, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 13. And we have Egypt as the type. The antitype is the world. Pharaoh, Satan, Moses is the deliverer. Here, Jesus is the deliverer. Israel, we have the church here. Moses the lawgiver, Jesus the lawgiver. The cloud and sea protected Egypt, or the Israelites. Baptism protects us if we are faithful till death. They were wandering in the wilderness. We have Christian life. They had the promised land of Canaan. We have the promise of heaven if we're faithful. That's basically what chapter 3 was teaching us. So, I don't want to disappoint you, so we'll have a few questions here to answer. And I actually put the verse up there so you know where the answer is. And all I need you to do is answer the question. So who is it? Who is the house over which Christ is a son? Huh?
His own house.
His own house, right. Moses served as a testimony for what?
Which would be spoken later.
Okay, those things that would be spoken later. What happened to the carcasses of the Israelites who displeased God? It fell in the wilderness. Okay. What did God swear concerning the Israelites who grieved him? All right. What kept the Israelites from entering his rest? Okay, unbelief. We are partakers of Christ if we do what? If we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the rest, or to the end. To what does the word provocation refer in verse 8 and verse 15?
Not to harden your heart when you hear his voice.
Okay, all right. And a one-word description is rebellion. Okay? All right, that answers those questions. So now, guess he didn't even want this one on. Doesn't matter. Oh, now it's on. All right. So, chapters 1 through 11. We're going to talk about the Christian Sabbath. And the fact that the book of Hebrews, Jesus is greater, is what it's talking about. And so, when we look at the Christian Sabbath, we have to think about the Sabbath in the Old Testament. And that is, the Sabbath was not mentioned until when? Any ideas?
Moses.
Until Moses. Genesis, the 2nd chapter, verses 1 through 3, tells us that. It states that God blessed the seventh day. Okay? So, however, if Adam, Noah, Abraham, and the other ancients were commanded to keep the seventh day Sabbath, the Bible nowhere tells us to do that. Even though there are religions today who still hold fast to the Sabbath. Jehovah or Seventh-day Adventist is one of those religions. My dad, working at a feedlot and everything, his boss was a Seventh-day Adventist, and he expected my dad to work on Sunday. And my dad said, "No, if you're not going to work on Saturday, then I'm not going to work on Sunday because I don't celebrate the seventh day. I celebrate the first day of the week." Of course, my dad was not religious to begin with. In fact, the first time that I ever knew that he stepped inside of a building is we carried him inside when he was buried. But the point is, there are people today that still think the Sabbath is important. So the facts about the Sabbath was first mentioned after Israel left Egypt. That's in Exodus 16th chapter, verses 23 through 30. This was first done where? When they left Egypt, when was the Sabbath first mentioned or done, observed? When? No. Before that. Exodus 20th chapter, verses 8 through 11. We don't need to turn there, but this was when they were at Mount Sinai. And this was when the Sabbath was first observed at Mount Sinai. Okay? It was directed to Israel to observe the Sabbath. If you will, turn to Deuteronomy, the 5th chapter. We're going to look at, I get there we go. We're going to look at verses 1 through 3 and then verse 15. And Moses called all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your hearing today, that you may learn them and be careful to observe them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, those who are here today, all of us who are alive." Now, go to verse 15. It says, "And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." And so we see the commandment there. Now, we can also go and look at Exodus, the 31st chapter and verse 16, and we would see the same thing. But why were they instructed to observe the Sabbath? It was instructed as a sign between God and Israel. Go to now let's go to Exodus, the 31st chapter. And we want to look at verse 13. Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbath you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. And look at verse 17. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Now, let me just mention, I could show you some other verses as well, but there's always been this argument about the 6 days of creation. Were they thousands of years, or were they 24 hours, or whatever? When God says this to the Israelites, they understood exactly what 6 days were and what the seventh day was. So it was 24-hour days, period. God doesn't take thousands of years to create something. If God speaks, it's done. And that's the 6 days of creation. So they fully understood this. So it was instructed as a sign between God and Israel. The Sabbath then was to remind them of God's deliverance. Go back to Deuteronomy, the 5th chapter, if you will, and look at verse 15. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 15. Says, And remember that you were a slave to the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And so indeed it was to remind them of God's deliverance then. Any comments up to this point? Yes, Jack.
Well, wasn't the Sabbath, the reason it changed to Sunday was we were to give us prosperity on the first day of the week. So the Christian deal back then decided we will, since we got a meat to give anyway, as we were prosper, we will go ahead and celebrate, break the bread and all that on the first day of the week too. So
Right, but the seventh, your question's a good question. The seventh day of the week was never changed. That was Sunday through Saturday, okay? And that's why you look at the Seventh-day Adventists today, they still hold from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. That's their seventh day. And that's the same way that the Jews look at it as well. Even today, they recognize the Sabbath as sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. And even when Christ hung on the cross, he had to be taken off the cross before, at the end of that third day. And so, on the first day of the week, he arose, which was Sunday. And when he arose from the grave, the church was established 50 days later on the day of Pentecost, which was the first day of the week. And so from that point on, we were to observe the first day of the week. And even when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, it was designed, and that's the important thing to remember. You have a lot of religions today that use alcoholic wine for the fruit of the vine. But it could not have been any alcohol, because when Christ instituted the Lord's Supper, this was at the Passover. And with the Passover, there could be no leavening. You remember back there when they were delivered from Egypt and everything, they were instructed not to take any leavening with them, that they were to move quickly. And of course, any leavening for bread and everything takes time. You ladies know that better than I do. But so they were instructed not to have any leavening, which meant also any grape juice they had could not have been wine, because it would have had leavening in it. So when he instituted the Lord's Supper, it was during the Passover. So the bread was no leavening in it, and the fruit of the vine was no leavening in it. So that's probably more information than you wanted, but your question is a good question, Jack. Any other comments? Yes, Nola?
Well, it's a misnomer to say that it's a Christian Sabbath. Either it's the first day of the week or the seventh. It can't be both.
Right.
That's what I was getting at. The Christian changed it to Sunday the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the Lord did.
The Lord did, yeah. Eugene?
Senior Christian?
Well, you said you didn't think that was, you thought that was more information than we needed. Well, I never heard that before about the leavening, but I've heard this argument back and forth, was it alcohol or was it not?
Yeah.
And it makes sense what you're saying, but other, preachers who talked about that never mentioned the leavening that I can recall. So,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other comments? Yes, Rick?
Question. Now, when you say leavening, can you be more specific?
Yeah, when you're making bread, it's yeast.
Okay,
Okay,
yes, I
that's
understand
leavening.
that one.
Yeah.
Now,
And if you take the fruit of the vine and you ferment it, that's a similar kind of like a yeast that creates the alcohol in the fruit of the vine, and that's the leaven. Does that make sense?
You use yeast.
that's why I was wondering about how they were the same.
Yeah.
You use yeast to make wine.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't.
Rick doesn't use yeast to make wine.
I don't make wine.
Oh. Well, I thought you just didn't use yeast to make your wine. That's what you said. I don't.
Does it sound like I do? I don't.
Oh, well, I'm really surprised you're here this morning, Kathy. I just knew you would be down there with the University of Texas yesterday.
Yeah.
They wouldn't give you a seat, would they?
We almost left yesterday morning.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Rick, Chris?
Yeast feeds on the sugar converts to alcohol.
True. Any other comments? All right, let's move on then. So, here's something that a lot of people don't really think about, and that is the fact that Jesus indeed obeyed the law of Moses. And he was a Jew in the flesh. And oh, there we go. He perfectly kept the law of the Lord, the law of Moses, including the Sabbath. Look at Luke, the 4th chapter, if you will. And we're going to look at verse 16. Luke 4 and verse 16. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Okay? So what we know then is that he indeed kept the law. Was he circumcised?
He kept the law.
Look at Luke, the 2nd chapter, and verse 21. Second chapter of Luke and verse 21. This is Jesus presented at the temple in Jerusalem. And it says, and when 8 days were completed for the circumcision of the child, his name was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. So this is what I'm saying. Jesus kept the law when Jesus lived. He also kept the Passover. We know that because that's when he instituted the Lord's Supper. But if you go back to Matthew the 26th chapter and look at that, and we're going to look at verses 17 through 25. 26th chapter, verses 17 through 25. And this is where, indeed, we had the preparation for the Passover here. Verse 17 says, Now on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he said, Go into the city to a certain man, and say to him, The teacher says, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When evening had come, he sat down with the 12. Now as they were eating, he said, Assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and each of them began to say to him, Lord, is it I? He answered and said, He who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me. The Son of Man indeed goes just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Then Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? He said to him, You have said it. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, Take, eat, this is my body. Now I've always marveled about that statement and everything. When he said someone was going to betray him, it appears that each disciple asked, Is it I? Now, I've always used this statement as if someone asks me if I'm going to heaven, and I say, well, I hope so, or I think I will, that's kind of what the disciples just did here. Is it I? But then Judas, he also asked that question. But in this situation, Jesus said, as you have said. Judas knew it was him. The other disciples should have known it wasn't him. Eugene?
Well, I always assumed that Judas was sitting beside Jesus because he had dipped the bread with him.
Right.
And I've always wondered, well, how loudly were they speaking? I mean, could all the others hear what Judas said and Jesus' answer? Or, was it like a whisper?
Well, and that's a good one, I
You'd
guess.
think there would have been more conversation if they had all heard it.
But
But it's not
do keep
recorded.
in mind that there were 12 people here assembled around this table, so I'm sure that they could all hear the conversation. And when Jesus said, as you have said, the other disciples may not have fully understood what Jesus was saying at this point. Nola?
I may be wrong, I don't remember correctly, but Judas wasn't sitting next to Jesus.
I don't know exactly where he was sitting.
It does tell us that John was leaning against his breast.
Right.
And I thought the other person was Peter on the other side.
Could have been. And I certainly won't dispute that. It doesn't matter exactly where Judas was sitting because each one of them had the dish, if you want to call
Yeah,
it.
they could-
And he gave them the commandment to, as you saw, so, and said, one of you is going to betray me. So each one of them going around the table said, is it I? But then Judas was the last one to speak, and he said, is it I? And Jesus at that point said, as you have said. And so the point of the whole message that I'm trying to get across here is in all cases, Jesus did in fact observe the old law. Okay? As he was living, because the first day of the week had not been established yet until he dies and rises from the dead on the first day of the week, until the church was established on the first day of the week. None of that had happened. And so up to that point, he's going to observe the old law. Any comments?
If he didn't, he would have been sinning. He was born
True.
a Jew
Very
through his
true.
mother.
That's
And-
very true.
And yeah, so he had to keep the law.
Okay? So, Yeah.
I wonder if he actually gave them the sacrifices because he never sinned.
Well, that's true. But here's the thing. The Pharisees did accuse him of violating the Sabbath.
But they lied all the time.
Well, I don't know, though. I wasn't there, so I don't know if they lied all the time.
We've got so many lies they tell about Jesus.
But here's the thing. I want you to turn to Mark, the 2nd chapter. I'll put it up here. And we're going to look at verses 27 and 28. Mark 2, verses 27 and 28. This is where the Pharisees challenged him. And verse 24 says, "And the Pharisees said to him, Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" 25 says, "But he said to them, Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priest, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." So that's how Jesus responded to the Pharisees when they accused him of violating the Sabbath, that he indeed was Lord also of the Sabbath. By this, he was claiming his superiority to and authority over the Sabbath, which had been required of the Jews. He knew the purpose of the Sabbath because the covenant with Israel was still in effect during his lifetime. And we find that go to Matthew, the 12th chapter. And we're going to look at verses 11 and 12 of Matthew, the 12th chapter. This is Jesus healing on the Sabbath, okay? If you look at verse 9, "And now when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Now why would Jesus use this analogy? What were the Jews allowed to do under the old law? When you go back to the Old Testament, what were they allowed to do?
On the Sabbath, they weren't allowed to do anything.
Well, they weren't allowed to do anything. But in this situation, they were allowed, if there was one sheep, they were allowed to rescue that sheep.
But
Okay?
they would go do it, but even though they was violating it,
That's true.
they still would go do it, and that's why Jesus confronted them on the situation, because he healed a man. They saying, well, what are you doing? What Jesus had to explain to him.
Okay?
And then he got to tell him, well, isn't the man more, important than the sheep?
Yeah. That's what he's saying there in Matthew. Now turn to John, the 5th chapter. John, the 5th chapter. And let's look at verses 17 through 19. Now, here in John the 5th chapter, verses 17 through 19, Jesus is claiming equality with the Father. He says in verse 17, "But Jesus answered them, My Father has been working until now, and I have been working." Therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. Then Jesus answered and said to them, Most assuredly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do, for whatever he does, the Son also does in like manner. For the Father loves the Son, and shows him all things that he himself does, and he will show him greater works than these, that you may marvel. Now, of course, the Pharisees and the scribes were constantly looking ways to crucify Jesus Christ. And now in this situation, Jesus is saying he's equal to God. So that creates other problems for them here. But, yes, Jared?
You're talking about Christ being under the law and about under the Sabbath, etc. But in Hebrews chapter 9, starting at verse 16, it says, For where there is a testament, there must also be necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Therefore, so it's saying that Christ, of course, once he died, New Testament went into effect. But since he was alive, he lived under the Old Testament.
That's true. That's true. So Jesus did indeed keep the Sabbath requirements, because the covenant with Israel was still in effect during his lifetime. However, the Gentiles, were they commanded to keep the Sabbath?
No.
Nope. They were never commanded to keep the Sabbath. So we know that Christ gave us a new commandment, that indeed the law was fulfilled. That's what we saw in Matthew the 5th chapter, verses 17 and 18. We could go to Romans the 7th chapter, if you'll turn there with me. And we're going to look at verses 7 through 12. This is what we're seeing when Paul was talking to the church at Rome. He was pointing out that the believer, the Christian, is not made holy by the law. Beginning in verse 7, he says, What shall we say then? Is the law of sin? Certainly not. Only on the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law, for I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, You shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire, for apart from the law, sin was dead. I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. Therefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just and good. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. So the point that Paul is making here, and we know how sinful Paul was before he became a Christian. And Paul's making the point here that had it not been for the old law, I would not know what God requires of me. And because I know what God requires of me, I can live the kind of life He expects me to live. It's the same thing as we have today. If it were not for this traffic light out here, and ironically everybody calls it a stoplight, but it's a go light as much as it is stop. But to us it's a hindrance because it makes us stop. But had it not been for that law or that light, you can imagine how many wrecks would occur at that intersection. And that's law. And that's what the old law did for us today. It taught us what God expects us to do as Christians. Nola?
The minute you make a law, or a rule. Somebody wants to break it, like you see in your children, don't do this. Well, if you hadn't said it, they probably wouldn't do it, but because you made it a rule, they'll break it.
Yeah. On a side note, I wish our politicians would understand that. Yeah, I don't want to get into political, but when you have in 3 days' time, a 1,500-page bill, and nobody's gonna read it, it's kinda like Nancy Pelosi said back during Obamacare, we gotta pass it so we know what's in it. And amazingly, that 1,500-page bill ended up being only 165 pages after they came to their senses. Our politicians need to study the scriptures a lot.
You think they came to their senses?
No. Maybe the American people will wake up someday and realize that, hey, we can make a difference. And I used to go to Branson a lot, and there was a comedian there. I loved him. I can't remember his name. He used to be with Pierce Arrow. And at the end of his comedy skit, he said something very profound. And basically it was one vote by, I think, Madeleine O'Hara. One vote changed the law in such that God was taken completely out of the school system. And the point of that is that your vote matters. Same thing with the scriptures. Each one of us matters. Each one of us is important, and each one of us, if we value our souls, we should also value the souls of others. And we should indeed do everything we can, not only to save our soul, but to help save the souls of others. Enough said on that. Any comments? Kathy, you've been awful quiet.
Amen.
Okay. So however, indeed, he is the fulfillment of everything to which the law pointed. Since he fulfilled it, the work of the law indeed was completed then. So this is what the Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews the 8th chapter, verses 8 through 13, is that, yes?
Before you go any further, how
Yes.
do we fulfill the law of Christ?
Well, we fulfill the law of Christ.
How
by,
do we do it?
Yeah, by living Christ.
By being faithful,
Yeah,
by keeping his commandments.
right.
I don't want to ask my own question, but
Well, you can answer your own question. I don't care.
Hebrews 5:9.
okay, yeah.
Well, we're going to go to Hebrews the 8th chapter.
Okay.
But that's a good question. Makes people think. I want to look at Hebrews the 8th chapter, verses 8 through 13. This is talking about actually we'll begin at verse 7. This is talking about the new covenant, okay? The Hebrew writer says, "For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. Because finding fault with them, he says, Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they did not continue in my covenant, and I disregarded them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws in their mind and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." And so indeed, we observe the new law by obeying Jesus Christ. We need also go to the 9th chapter and look at verses 15 through 17. 9th chapter, verses 15 through 17. "And for this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives." And so indeed, This is what Jared had read earlier. Any comments?
Yeah, second battle.
Good comment. All right, we'll continue this next week, chapter 4, lesson 5.